Have you ever experienced unexpected emotions, anxiety or anger, without there seeming to be any good reason for it? You're just going about your day and suddenly you're in an uncomfortable emotional state. Maybe you even notice how your heart starts pounding more vigorously and you start sweating. In this video, I will explain what this is, where it comes from, and how to rewire your brain so it doesn't cause problems for you. Hey everyone, I'm Maika, a psychologist, and this is Becoming an Expert at Self-Leadership. In order to understand where unexpected, seemingly irrational, uncomfortable emotions come from, we need to understand where the brain produces emotions when it's responding to threat and danger. There are two main ways that are very different from one another. I promise that everything I'm about to explain is worth the effort of understanding and has tremendous potential to fundamentally change your approach to self-leadership. It starts out with a trigger. This is any information that we process through the senses. The information about the trigger is forwarded to a brain structure called the thalamus. And from there, information is sent to both the cortex, this large gray area, and the almond-shaped structure here called the amygdala, which we actually have two of on both sides of the brain. If a trigger is associated with danger in the amygdala will then initiate a stress response, also called the fight, flight, or freeze response, because those are the three main functions of the stress response: to fight, protective action; flight, avoiding danger by leaving the situation; and freeze, avoiding danger by not drawing attention on ourselves. So there's two ways in which this process can unfold, starting from a trigger, going all the way to the fight, flight, and freeze response. One of those pathways goes through the cortex, the other one doesn't. It goes directly to the amygdala. This is important to take note of because only one of these pathways is easily observable and accessible to our awareness, thoughts, logic, and reason. And that is the pathway through the cortex. Cortex-based anxiety or anger is mediated by how we make meaning of a situation. And we are, in that instance, aware of what is causing our worries or anger. And because the cortex sees it as something to be threatened by, it prompts the amygdala to initiate a stress response. This can be called for or not. It's called for in situations where the energy that's created by the stress response helps us take action in helpful ways, like taking preventative measures when there's a flood approaching the area we live in, or if we've overcommitted and need to do something to take a few things off of our plate. It's not called for in situations where the cortex has labeled something as threatening that actually is safe. And by avoiding that situation, we are then causing problems for our life. Like if we're not opening a letter because we're afraid of its contents, or if we avoid meeting friends or giving presentations at work. This part of the stress response can be influenced by logic and reasoning, by arguing with unhelpful thoughts and replacing them with helpful thoughts. I've talked about relevant strategies like cognitive diffusion and cognitive restructuring in other videos when we increase our awareness that thoughts are not necessarily based in reality and when we reshape thoughts. So this is one very important approach to rewiring our brain. the cortex-based rewiring. But the second part of our stress response isn't accessible to logic and reason. This is because it can be initiated directly by the amygdala without the information having passed through our cortex and conscious awareness. It's just like most of the time we're not aware of our digestion, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. This means the brain may have registered a trigger or threat, and the amygdala immediately called for anxiety or anger, but without that information having passed through the cortex and your awareness. So it seems like there is no good reason and explanation for the emotional states you're suddenly in. This is not a sign that something's wrong with your brain. This is, in general, a very helpful mechanism, but sometimes it can also need a bit of rewiring. And for that, we need to first understand the language of the amygdala. The way this amygdala-based stress response works is through associative learning. One of the roles of the amygdala is to attach emotional significance to memories. So throughout your whole life, throughout whatever you've experienced, your amygdala has been on the watch for situations in which it would be helpful to form connections between aspects of the situation and an emotional memory. This is a very individual process. You have very individual emotional memories stored in your brain that were created by the amygdala based on your personal life experiences. Some of these connections are genetic, like we all have an inborn stress response to snakes and spiders. Other connections are formed by associating a trigger with an emotional memory. We are not necessarily aware of all of these emotional memories, and they're not always connected to an inner image or verbally stored information. So that's why it can seem like our brain has taken on a life of its own when these emotional memories are activated and we suddenly feel overwhelmed by certain emotions and the stress response. The smell of a shampoo or hearing a song can easily trigger these emotions completely outside of your awareness. Just like with cortex-based decisions about threats, the amygdala can also be wrong about danger. This is when at some point in your life, it learned to categorize a harmless trigger as a threat. If you want to rewire this connection, that will not be possible through logic and reason. When someone is upset, anxious, or angry, it doesn't help them to tell them that it doesn't make sense to be anxious or upset or angry, because they are experiencing the biological reality of an activated emotional memory and the stress response. You can't always reason yourself out of an emotion, even if it seems like it doesn't make sense or it's irrational. If you want to rewire your amygdala so that it responds calmly to non-threatening situations, you need different strategies. The first strategy that I'd recommend for you to learn is how to calm your nervous system through relaxation techniques and grounding exercises. These are ways for you to directly reach your amygdala and set it onto a different course. Classical examples for these tools are muscle relaxation, abdominal breathing, meditation, imagery exercises when you imagine yourself into a calm environment. What's important for these to give their full benefit is to practice them regularly, at least until you've reached a certain skill level. It's also important to do something several times a day to calm your nervous system. Sleep and aerobic exercise of moderate intensity, like cycling, running, walking, and swimming, are also important parts of this approach to rewiring your upset brain and calming your amygdala. Studies have shown that when the amygdala doesn't get enough sleep, it reacts more negatively to situations and events. Another important strategy for rewiring your amygdala is by prompting it to form new associations through new experiences, exposure. This means to very, very gradually and slowly expose yourself to the object and situation that your amygdala has identified as threatening, and allowing it to experience that this object or situation is actually safe. This sounds scary and challenging, and it can be, but it's actually one of the most science-backed strategies to rewiring your amygdala. And you don't have to do it alone. There are trained professionals in these techniques that can help you sort it out. So look and ask for someone who works with exposure techniques. One of the most exciting things about our brain is its tremendous ability to change its structures and patterns. Sure, there are limits, but it's a lot more flexible than we used to think. This ability of the brain to change is called neuroplasticity. For example, brain circuits that are used to process visual information can learn to respond to sound in just a few days. And people whose brains were injured by a stroke can learn to coordinate their limbs with different brain areas. Our brains are not only determined by our genes, but also by our experiences, thinking, and behavior. So you too can rewire your brain, no matter how young or old you consider yourself to be. What do you think? This is quite fascinating, isn't it? To think how often we try to solve problems using just logic and reason, and some things can't even be accessed by logic and reason. Luckily, you now know about these other methods to rewire your upset brain. If you want to learn more about that, check the description box for a book recommendation. And if you want to see more content like this, remember to subscribe. That way YouTube knows to recommend my videos to you. Till next time, bye-bye, and take good care of your amygdala.